It's really a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Garrison Institute's Wisdom Holders Circle Luncheon for what promises to be an enlightening conversation with Jonathan and Andrew about the resilient city. This is an especially important topic for us because in many ways, since the Institute was founded in 2003, all of our work has been focused on building the resilience of individuals, families, communities, and professionals in a time of extraordinary social and environmental change. While tremendous attention and resources are rightfully being devoted to strengthening and building resilient physical infrastructures, our programs and retreats are providing tools and methods that promote inner resilience, the ability to recover and even thrive in the face of disruption and dislocation. And we're seeing that for professionals who care for or advocate for others, this inner work translates into improved health, reduced stress, more compassionate and effective service to their communities, and shifts in the organizational systems that they're embedded in. We've developed contemplative-based training models for teachers, domestic violence shelter workers, humanitarian aid workers, and now with support from the JPB Foundation, we're embarking on a very exciting project to prepare social service workers in low-income communities for the disruptions of climate change and the endemic stress of poverty and the lack of resources to respond to crises. Because we understand the deeply interconnected nature of complex problems, we approach them holistically, and we involve scientists, frontline professionals, systems thinkers, and contemplative experts in collaborative design processes that are having remarkable effects. So in this spirit today, we will hear from two people whose work embraces complexity and interconnectivity, systems thinking, and a pragmatic approach to the issues we face. Jonathan Rose is the founder of Jonathan Rose Companies, a mission-focused real estate development, planning, and investment firm. He's a thought leader in the community development field, advancing thinking and solutions to the integrated issues of environment, affordable housing, community education, health, and opportunity. He's the co-founder of the Garrison Institute, along with his wife, Deanna Rose, and created its Climate Mind and Behavior program. Jonathan is completing a book on the evolution of cities, The Well-Tempered City, to be published by HarperCollins in the fall of 2015. Andrew Zolli is a futurist researcher who works at the intersection of global innovation, foresight, social change, and resilience. He studies trends in technology, the global environment, and how systems interact with each other over the long term. He spends much of his time advancing a global dialogue on resilience, how to help people and systems persist, recover, and thrive amid disruption. For the last 12 years, he's led the transformation of pop tech into a renowned innovation and social change network, and he's a National Geographic Fellow. Andrew is the co-author of the landmark book, Resilience, Why Things Bounce Back, published by Simon & Schuster. So we will hear about the ways that cities are becoming crucibles of resilience at a time of great social, economic, geopolitical, and climatological disruption, how resilience works at the individual, community, and urban levels, and what agenda this suggests for the future. And I know that all of you are experts in your own right and in your own field, so after we finish the formal portion of the dialogue, we invite you to participate and join us for this journey of discovery. And we'd like to use the Jeffersonian format for the luncheon, which is that hopefully we'll be having a lot of crosstalk around the room, one person at a time, addressing everybody else. So let's see how that works, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. And please begin eating. We should do a short dialogue, so we need to.
We should. So should we start?
Yeah.
Terrific. Okay. Hi, everybody. Hi. How are you all? It's great to be here with you. I hope you don't mind. I just put my laptop up because it's how I organize my notes. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you here this afternoon. I just want to say a couple of very quick things. One of the true pleasures of my life has been getting to know Jonathan and Deanna Rose and the whole team at Garrison, some of whom are just brand new into the organization. And it's a wonderful thing to see its growth and expansion. We live in a world where, especially, it's kind of a funny paradox of the times we live in, that we have more information. We have so much information, we have to give it size adjectives. We live in the age of big data, bigger data, humongous data, like vast troves of information, and yet very little historical memory and almost no context. And in that circumstance, people who work in the fields of social change, people who think about how to bring wisdom forward in the world, are in the paradoxical circumstances in which we have lots of signals, but not very many mentors and peers. And one of the great pleasures of my personal and professional life has been developing this relationship. And so I wanted to talk today just for a couple of minutes so that we can really have a conversation, Jonathan, and just a couple kind of opening ideas for you. So because we don't have visuals here and I can't show you graphics, I'd like you to just engage with me for a moment in an act of imagination. And I want to ask you a question. What do you think is the relationship between the number of major stressful events you've experienced in your life and your overall levels of psychosocial resilience? What do you think the relationship is? Let's imagine we made a little graph like this, okay? And on the vertical axis, we have your degree of resilience. And on the horizontal axis, we had the total cumulative amount of lifetime major stressful events that you'd experienced in your life. What do you think the diagram would look like?
More resilience comes from more stressful events.
So it could go like this, right? So you go from more stressful events, more resilience over time, okay? That's one terrific hypothesis. Let's see if other thoughts.
I think it would go up to a certain point, level off, and then drop back
Up and then down.
Or bell curve.
Also up and then down. Any other thoughts? Well, you're 100% right. The relationship between those two is a relationship of an inverted U. So I'd like to talk for a moment about how we came up with that idea, how we began to see that. A pioneering psychologist named Mark Seary at the University of Buffalo did a series of pioneering experiments in which he began first by surveys to identify people who'd been through lots of cumulative lifetime stress, and then began to measure them using standard measures of psychosocial resilience. And one of the things that he found was that people who had not been through a lot of stress had not experienced the inoculative power sometimes of receiving stressors. It's actually, some stress actually tests and improves us. And what he found is that there's a sort of warm zone where those additives, cumulative stresses over time, build our capacity to deal with future adversity. But as you continue to pile them up, it curves down on the other side. But this is the part that I thought was really fascinating about his research. How many other things were correlated in the same U-shaped pattern, like life satisfaction, voting patterns, physical pain tolerance, and countless other both physical and social phenomena were all correlated with this inverted U-shaped graph. And in fact, and then another inverted U-shaped graph, which had to do with the presentation of traumatic stress symptoms when people got disrupted. The reason I mention this, and I wanted to start with this, is that I think that when we have a conversation about cities, we have a conversation about the people that live in them, and how we encourage people to persist, recover, or even thrive amid enormous disruption, volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity, all of those kinds of factors. Systems work this way too. And so we're actually talking, when we're talking about building systems that can persist, recover, or thrive amid disruption, about systems that are experiencing two kinds, or maybe experiencing a couple different kinds of environments. One of the great observations of this inverted U-shaped curve is that people who have not experienced enough stress and people who have experienced way too much may be equally vulnerable. And interestingly, Siri and his colleagues then looked at the median and the average, and what he found was that most people, and in fact by most measures, most people clustered just on the negative, detrimental side of too much stress. The average was that most people were more stressed out, and the mean and the median all clustered very closely in this particular example. Now, the reason I mention this to you today is that more than anything else, the fact that we are dealing both with long, slow, persistent, and pernicious forms of stress in our bodies, in our minds, and in our physical environments, in particular in our cities. And the fact that we are experiencing short, sharp shocks that exacerbate those long, slow forms of risk are driving this new conversation about how we build resilience in the world. And it's bringing forward two new pattern languages of systems design and social intervention and innovation. One of them is focused on systems and a language for how we build, how we relate the built environment to the natural world. And so that's a conversation in which the themes you start to see reappearing are things like modularity, diversity, transparency, systems that have tight feedbacks but are only loosely coupled, so that systems can break apart when necessary, so that a failure in one place doesn't cascade forward into everywhere else and bring the whole system crashing down. A kind of metabolic dynamism. Metaphors that are taken from biology show up here in how we build. And building environments that can accommodate volatility as opposed to merely trying to resist them. Fundamentally, we're talking about building systems that learn, and learn in new ways. So there's a new language happening there. It's a language that informs architecture and public policy. It informs the way we think about the way our communities relate to each other. And then there's another dialogue, and that dialogue is about how we bolster the capacity of people to persist, recover, or thrive amid disruption. And the key watchwords of that discussion are things like trust, and cooperation, and creativity, and coherence, and compassion, solidarity, and voice, and especially, and most recently, concepts of narrative openness. How do we ensure that people in the midst of stress and complexity and change understand that their story doesn't come to an end? And that is one of the places where, because when you think your story has come to an end, you stop acting, you stop advocating for self. So when we think about our physical environments, one of the things that I think about is what those environments say to those people who live in them. Do you live in a community that tells you that you matter? Do you live in a community whose architecture and physical environments tell you that you are worth saving or not? Do they tell you that you can trust your neighbors and ought to trust your neighbors, and that you belong to some larger corpus? Those kind of values that are incorporated in placemaking matter more now than ever before. We're going to have a much more conversation, so I'm just kind of throwing a few things out to get us started. The last piece of this that I thought I would share with you is a kind of mental model that I found really helpful in having conversations that have to be necessarily as broad-shouldered as the ones that we're talking about here. And that's a mental model for how we build systems that are resilient, how we build systems in communities that can bounce back and bounce forward. And that mental model, one of the things that's been interesting about it is that I've been able to have conversations with people in neuroscience and architecture and public policy and public health. And whether you're talking about the people who live in a community, the neurons in your head, or the pattern of interactions between different parts of the natural world, people have found common cause over this model. So let me just describe it to you. I have a lot of questions that often come up about how do you put these concepts of resilience into practice? So here's a kind of mental model with 4 buckets. So the first one, I want you to sort of imagine, I'll just walk through them like this. I'll try to do it backwards, because for you. Okay, so over here we have every system that is resilient engages in processes of long, slow, regenerative capacity building. That process typically tends to be slower. It's often invisible. In a community context, it's measured by things like trust, creativity, entrepreneurialism, right? But also, these are the capacities that enable the generation of future capacity, right? Investment, sense of social coherence. But every system, even the neurons in your head, are doing things to build their own regenerative capacity. This is the long, slow process of health making and building health that defines a healthy system. The second cluster of activities are about listening for change. How do we instrument a community, a system, a society, a person, a family, to be able to sense impending risk and change? Now, not every form of disruption can be sensed, right? Surprises are inevitable, and in fact, the whole rise of the resilience narrative, I think, has largely come about because so much volatility has made planning very difficult. So surprises become inevitable in such an environment. So even though we can't hear every form of change, every form of disruption, the very act of listening is itself a form of capacity building. And it requires us to have conversations about what to do, right? Listening is a form of preparedness for change. The third bucket is about responding to disruptions when they occur. That third cluster of activities, one thing I can tell you, having traveled with my colleagues and continuing to do this work now, traveling around the world from the coral reefs of Palau to the backstreets of Palestine to Haiti and New Orleans and all kinds of places in between, is that the one thing we've seen about resilient responses is that they are almost always what we call ad hocratic. They're not bureaucratic. They're not, something goes wrong and someone doesn't pull down a Plan 23B off a shelf. Instead, what they do is, it looks more like a game of pickup basketball. Right? People take bits of tools and technologies and social networks and leadership structures and they put them together for what's needed right then. And that's why trust and social coherence and sense of belonging, those long, slow forms of health building in communities matter so much, because if they are not there the day before things go wrong, they will make it impossible the day after things go wrong. And then finally, there's this lasting bucket, which is about learning and transformation. It's about what happens, how do we decide when a system has shown itself to be vulnerable that we need to build it up again? And when do we decide that we need to abandon it for something better? And that is ultimately a political and a community conversation. Learning and transformation happens in many different ways. And the thing I will tell you is that learning and transformation is long and slow. Building regenerative capacity is long and slow. So these are long and slow cycles at the outside. And sensing and listening for change and responding to change are fast cycles. So part of the story of resilience is about how we build systems that can behave both quickly and slowly, right? How do we create structures that build and listen and respond and learn? So there's a lot to unpack there. And I know that we started with a kind of very philosophical level. We'll dig into a real conversation about practical matters. But what I find interesting about this is that the way an ecosystem does the four things I just described to you is slightly different than the way the muscle cells in your heart do it. It's a little bit different than the way a community does it in a coastal community. But the lessons of one may hold insights for the other. And so one of the things that's happening is this conversation is bringing together people who are working at the forefront of the physical sciences, the social sciences, urbanists, people who are thinking about organizational structure, people who are thinking about complex adaptive systems more generally. And that is incredibly exciting because all of these metaphors, they spontaneously emerge just ahead of the arrival of the real language. And I think one of the things that's interesting about where we are right now is that we are just ahead of, just at the very beginning of a new dialogue about how we live with all this volatility and how we learn from all these systems. And we're just at the point where all these metaphors are about to give way to things that are far more concrete. So you've arrived right at the introduction rather than at the conclusion of the discussion. And with that, I'll let Jonathan say a few words. Thanks.
I love listening to Andrew. He's a fantastic thinker. I'm going to close your computer. And actually, I'm going to pick up on a point that you just made, which is you said the way that ecosystems respond is slightly different than the way human systems respond. This has been a really interesting challenge for me and something that I think a lot about and have not resolved, and maybe we can hear it today actually, which is that human systems are part of life, we are nature, we are life, and yet we think differently, we are separate too in some ways, and I actually think that bridging that gap is necessary, but there's one unbridgeable way that we are different, and that is that Garrison Institute board member Paul Hawkins says that when there's a disruption in nature, nature's propensity is to heal. So imagine a forest fire or an earthquake zone and the land is totally barren and life comes back and it has a strategy for how it comes back with weeds, etc. And it all grows, and hundreds of years later you'd never know there was disruption was there. It's self-healing and self-repairing. And the best that we know that, there's no master planner, there's no one with intention. It's built into the very regenerative, adaptive capacity of life itself and of ecosystems itself. When we have disruptions of human systems, when our cities fall to, are disrupted by a hurricane or an earthquake or violence or, blown up in a war, they don't naturally come back. They don't naturally heal. And it takes human intentionality actually to restore. Human intentionality has the benefit that it comes with morality, that it comes with a moral system. We actually make decisions as to what we think is right and wrong. Nature does not have an apparent intentionality. It has an inherent right and wrong that we can impute from it and infer from it, but it's not making the kind of moral decisions that we are. And so there's a difference, and I think that actually comes with an advantage and a disadvantage, and we need to figure that out. Andrew noted that we live in an age of volatility, and he actually referred to a phrase which I want to explore a little more, that the military started in the 1990s called VUCA, which stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We live in a much more volatile age if you think about financial volatility, the climate volatility, social unrest, etc. I mean, for example, a couple of years ago there were riots in London. Who thought there would have been riots in London? Shortly after there were riots in Cairo and many other places around the world. So we live in a much more volatile time, which is much more difficult to not only to manage, particularly if you're trying to manage a city, but it's a time in which, so there's ambiguity when you have complex systems, when you have complicated systems. So it's very easy to understand the outcome. So for example, New York City's water supply is a complicated system. It's got millions of pipes and valves, etc. But essentially, there is a reservoir at the top of the system, and there's valves at the bottom of the system, a lot of pipes, and the water flows by gravity from the top to the bottom. Complex systems, the different parts also interact with each other, that the effect of one affects the other, and you get this co-emergent, co-arising, co-evolving result. And so one input, you don't exactly know what the output's going to be. So this leads to great more ambiguity. So as we're a more complex, volatile, and ambiguous time, and much more connected time, it's much harder to manage a city or manage any system. And when the system, and to figure out how to make it resilient, you can't manage it using complicated tools. You actually have to use a new set of tools that Andrew referred to. So you have to use complexity to manage complexity. And as Andrew noted, our systems are highly stressed. So not only our cognitive psychological systems, our social systems are so hugely stressed, if you think about it. But also, for example, in New York City, our water and sewer systems are over 100 years old. Same in Philadelphia, same in many, many cities. Even in the new cities of the West, like Phoenix, their systems are hugely overstressed. And then add to that our electrical systems, which are really outdated and based on an old model, a central model much more than a distributed model. And so we have systems that are also close to their breaking point. In Andrew's book, he refers to something called robust but fragile. So we used to create our resistance to stresses by making things stronger, making dams bigger, making levees stronger. And that works to a point, but when a strong system fails, it fails big, it cracks. So what we've learned is actually in this resilience study that we need not one solution, but multiple solutions. We need, so that if one part fails, and this is the way nature works, nature thrives, monocultures die, and it thrives by diversity, by biodiversity, so that there's a million solutions that are eventually available in the DNA, the gene pool of success. And our cities need, as they replace these 100-year-old robust but fragile systems, need to move towards systems that have much more diversity to them. There's an idea in ecology called ecological pressure. So ecological pressure is when there is a change in the ecological system that puts huge pressure on it. So for example, climate change is an ecological pressure. And if you look throughout the history of the climate, every once in a while, we get a global freezing. And when that happens, water gets trapped in ice, so there's less water available, there's more droughts. It gets colder, so it's harder for species to survive. And there's less biodiversity, it puts pressure on there are fewer resources in the ecological system. An example of ecological pressure in our own bodies is when we take an antibiotic. And it puts ecological pressure actually on the biodiversity of the biome in our gut. And what you sometimes see due to too much antibiotics is that the resistant bacteria thrives. We see this in hospitals, we see this in humans too, and it's not a good bacteria. And it's hard to get rid of it. It becomes a monoculture because the ecological pressure has squashed down the rest of the system. And so you don't always get good results from ecological pressure. If you look at the history of civilization, every once in a while there's been a very dramatic climate change that has created ecological pressure. It has dried up water. It has reduced food supplies. And most civilizations crash when that happens. So that's why the Mayan civilization died. That's why Angkor Wat and the Cambodian civilization died. That's why the Anasazi died. Those were naturally occurring climate changes. We happen to be causing a climate change. In some ways it matters, in some ways it doesn't. But when you take a highly stressed system, which we have, a hugely urbanized population, and the world is over 50% urbanized, it is about to become 70 or 80% urbanized, people say 80% by the end of this century. And you add the ecological pressure, which is already we're seeing is creating droughts, and is creating food shortages around the world, and there's a whole thing about resource depletion that's happening. Most civilizations, when they encounter this, unless they really have an internal framework of resilience, are robust but fragile, and they crash. And so this resilient dialogue is extremely important for our future. Now, what you see in resilient systems is that they have something called adaptive capacity. They have the natural capacity to respond. And that is really the key of what we need to create. And one of the key elements of adaptive capacity is altruism. altruism at the birth of human culture. It's that we actually thrive because we're a we and not a me. The ability of people to cooperate and collaborate is what has led to the advancement of civilization. Interestingly, we've looked at the difference between apes and humans, and why didn't apes and chimpanzees become us? And the only differentiating factor they can figure out is that we know how to collaborate. I'll give you a very simple example. Scientists have never seen two apes or monkeys or chimpanzees carry a log together. And we can do that very, very simply. So it is this cooperation, it is this altruism, it is trust, it is the social fabric that actually is key to the resilience of our cities. Thank you.
We are changing our relationship to failure. In some ways, we are changing our relationship to failure because externalized and exogenous shocks are just overwhelming many of the systems. And we see that happening in major cities, like we see it obviously around, most recently here around Sandy, but in countless places around the world. But failures are also how systems, they're intrinsic and essential for how systems learn. Without failures, you don't get the kind of trigger for dynamic reorganization that is so essential for working effectively in the next regime, in the emerging next regime. Now, the reason I ask you about this, Jonathan, is that you're just concluding a book, which I'm very excited about, called The Well-Tempered City, which I'm not sure if any of you, I think many people here know this, but it's really exciting. And I love this metaphor. And I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate on the idea of what it means to temper a system.
I will do that, but first can I talk about failure?
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier how important trust and
speak up a little bit.
So you mentioned earlier how important trust and transparency are.
Yeah.
And we are, if you think globally about most countries and even the United States, we are increasingly less transparent. There's a huge amount of data, but we don't really know what's going on. Mm-hmm. You can't operate a system well if you don't know what's going on. And in fact, we have developed a political culture where as politicians fail, they hide. They just cover up rather than reveal. So those are not good factors for the health of systems.
Yeah, I certainly think the U.S. may be the largest geopolitical, robust yet fragile system on the planet at the moment, which is worth some further discussion.
So on tempering, I think there are 5 kinds of temperament, and I'm not sure there's time to go into all of them. So I'll just pick one, and that is if you take steel. So iron and steel are very brittle. The process of tempering them is actually a process of making them more resilient. And this was actually discovered, several thousand years ago, and what led to the Bronze Age, and it was one of the great technical innovations of human culture. And so I'll give one other temperament. And so that kind of taking systems and moving them from brittleness to resilience is an important quality of cities. Another one, if you think about temperament, like we say, people are well-tempered, they're pleasant, they're nice to be around, etc. And so the issues of trust, altruism, social networks, all those things fall into that kind of well-tempered, it's another quality of a city to society that's really essential.
I really like that idea. I'm going to come back to it in just a second. But I want to read you a quote. This is a quote from you, and have you respond to it, if you would.
Okay.
You recently wrote, "Just as the world needs a healthy natural ecology to thrive, it also needs a healthy cognitive ecology, or a mental landscape of thinking, feeling, and relating. If we're going to ease endemic poverty, for instance, we need to recognize that it persists in an invisible, pervasive cognitive ecology of toxic stress that deeply permeates not only the families living in low-income communities, but also the caregivers who try to support them." So what I'm curious about is thinking as an urbanist. Can you talk about how we might design cities to help people better function? Like what is the relationship between the interventions of an urbanist and that mental cognitive ecology?
So first of all, by the way, I want to say that I think it's the mission of the Garrison Institute to understand the larger cognitive ecology and to find solutions to increase its resilience and its health. That's really at the core of what we're doing. And what we have seen is that all of our mindsets, and you started out so beautifully describing how stressed we are, that adds up to a cognitive ecology, a shared ecology, mental ecology that affects how we act. So the first thing is really simple. We know that contact with nature is a huge stress reducer and improves our attitudes, improves our feelings. And that cities, by their very nature, are more effective and function better if they are if they're denser. So we need to simultaneously densify our cities and imbue them with nature. So we need more central parks, we need more linear parks, we need more neighborhood parks, we need more green roofs. We can really fill our cities with nature at the same time as we densify them. And that has all kinds of wonderful side effects. It cools the cities from climate change. It absorbs stormwater. It actually increases biodiversity. By the way, some of the best honey in the world comes from cities because bees get honey from wherever they get it. They get the nectar from wherever they get it from. And in the countryside, it's highly toxic. It's got a lot of insecticides and fertilizers and stuff, which are not often used in cities. So it turns out that honey from Brooklyn is more pure than honey from East Hampton.
It comes with the...
and it's hipper too.
It's exactly what I was going to say. It's fertilized by the smugness of hipsters directly from their mustaches.
So the other, just another solution is we know that social networks are so important for resilience. And cities are fantastic places to connect people and to create thriving social networks.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing, and I want to push you a little bit on this idea of greening our cities. How do we, because one of the things that I'm a little bit concerned about is that greening our cities has turned into building skyscrapers and then putting some trees on the model, right? Do you know what I'm talking about? We see these, this is a skyscraper and then we just add a little, it's like a little ornament at the top. So, I think this is what you're pointing to is a much deeper idea about what it means to live in relationship to nature. And if I could elaborate while you think about how we prevent it from merely becoming a trope and really thinking about it as a principle. One of the things I'll share in my own research is that around the world, looking at how people respond to very serious disruption, one of the things we see over and over again and found is a kind of natural biophilic response among human beings. I traveled in places that were like in Joplin, where people had literally watched their family members get killed. People were planting within hours. They were literally picking up and putting seeds in the ground at the same time, in part because they wanted something to connect with something that was going to grow and that had the promise of growth. In Haiti, I saw people literally rubbing soil on their faces as a way of kind of connecting back to the physical environment, not the urban environment here. I'm talking about the natural world, and I think that is a tool for thinking about how, in the toolkit for how we build resilience, creating the opportunities to sort of amplify that natural, what we call urgent biophilia, is a really critical thing.
So I completely agree, and bringing nature back into cities, real nature back into cities. So by the way, that's another thing. It means that we have to use natural indigenous species. When you use, imagine a typical suburban landscape, if it's all filled with ornamental plants that are actually come from, Asian fruit trees, etc., and Japanese maples. For the local birds and butterflies and bees, they're sterile. Those are not their food, or that's not the pollen that they want. So it looks like it's nature, but it's actually a fake nature. It actually doesn't function like nature. So we actually have to rebuild our cities, not with much denser natural materials, etc., but they actually have to be the ones that are part of a local ecosystem. But the other thing, the lesson from nature is, nature works in these amazing cycles. So when we were children, we learned about how we breathe out carbon dioxide, and the trees breathe into carbon dioxide, and then they breathe out oxygen, and we're all cycled together. So there's an emerging idea called a cyclical economy, in which we take our wastes and we recycle them and we make them our inputs. And cities, which are the most dense places on Earth, are the best places to do that. So for example, there's more fiber per acre in New York City than there is in the Brazilian rainforest. So if you want to recycle paper, I mean, if you want to make paper, it's much cheaper and easier to actually recycle paper in New York where it's already here, or in major cities, than it is to go destroy a forest somewhere far away and cart it in. So we need to begin to look at our waste as resources. I'll give you one other example. We're now taking sewage treatment plants, taking the wastewater, cleaning it up and turning it into fresh drinking water, taking the sludge and turning it into soil enhancer for organic farms, and taking the methane that comes off it and burning it and turning it into local electricity making. And so what used to be a negative, a sewage treatment plant, is now a part of the generative capacity of the city.
So I'm sorry to jump in, but we need to rebuild our infrastructure a little bit here so that we can serve our entree. And so I'd like to ask if the two of you could sort of continue your conversation from your seats.
Yes.
Great.
And with everybody, I think it's time to hear from
invite
everybody
everybody
else.
to join us.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you. We might have to think about our relationship with the natural world not as seeking necessarily a pure, natural, perfect stability with the natural world, but rather a kind of continuous learning dynamic disequilibrium. And how those ideas relate to each other, I think, is something that I'm curious about, because I watched this resilience discussion emerge, and I've seen one really fascinating thing about it, which is that if you ask guys in Montana with gun racks on the back of their pickup, if they are sustainable, if you tell them you'd like them to behave more sustainably, they may take one of those guns out and shoot, give you a warning shot. If, on the other hand, you ask them how they are resilient, they will proudly tell you about how they share water and how they co-manage the land and how they see that as a principal value. And so there's a kind of conceptual opening there for a much more inclusive discussion. The rhetoric of resilience and its relationship to the kind of concepts that have come before, I think, are things that I'm acutely interested in. And I think they're raised by some of the questions about how we think about our relationship to the natural world.
Can I go back to a basic item you mentioned in the beginning, because I've been thinking about it, the U-curve. Okay. Is that the U-curve? Right?
Yeah.
Is that independent of time or age? In other words, if you have the same amount of stress involved, if it takes place over a year or a lifetime, do you get the same curve?
And the question that, and your name is?
Richard.
The question that Richard asked was about timing and the timing of stresses, which remains a largely unstudied, scientifically unstudied field. And in fact, in talking to Mark Seary, who's done a lot of this work, he's sort of chomping at the bit to look at the cadence of disruptions and your experience of them over time. So how long have you been around, and how do those disruptions cluster, and how does it affect the shape of the U? And what limited things we know are that there is a kind of, and this is true in general, there is a kind of warm zone where you have a cadence that's not of disruptions, where disruptions are not falling on top of themselves so much so that you cannot recover from the last one before you have hit the next one, but not so far spaced apart that you have forgotten the lessons of the last one and how to apply them to the next one. So what you want, and this is very early, non for publication yet kind of work, is that when we think about tempering an environment, whether it's a city, a system, or a person, the cadence matters a lot. And one thing to say about that is that it raises natural questions about memory. For instance, Jonathan mentioned the financial crisis in 2008, which I've done a lot of writing about. And it's not surprising that it came almost 10 years exactly after we repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. It took about 10 years for the banks to get into trouble after we repealed Glass-Steagall for us to see the crisis happen. But we repealed Glass-Steagall right at the moment demographically when most of the people who'd lived through the Depression were out of the voting pool. So we'd lost the memory of why we needed those rules in the first place, so it was easier to argue for their elimination. And one of the things that we found again and again in resilient systems is that resilient places are places, the most resilient places in the world are ones that have experienced past failure. Not that are perennially and just utterly, burned to the ground, but that regularly experience this kind of cadence, and that memory is often transmitted culturally through the arts and through food traditions and through these ways of remembering the past. They're remembered through religious traditions. In New Orleans, it's at the heart of the blues. I like to tell a story about my grandmother who, my Nana, who when I was 5 years old took me in the backyard and told me how to eat and cook dandelions. And she got very serious with me about how to cook dandelions, which, by the way, I will tell you now, these are not dandelions, but like a plate of dandelions like this now costs like $50 in Manhattan. My grandmother was teaching me to eat them because they were Depression food. She wanted to carry on this kind of transmission of this memory of the past. So I think an interesting question for cities is, how do cities remember? And how is that memory transmitted effectively? And it may be bigger than policy. The way that people remember is often through rituals and the arts and the traditions of place that make a place unique.
Friends of mine that try to operate in the field of reusable energy or green energy find that the people that were really at the top of their game in terms of recycling were the mafia families. Yeah. And so maintaining the metaphor is like, okay, so if the system needs to be resilient, what do we do about corruption? Because we were talking about trust. I want to trust my system, but if inside the system there are elements that are corrupt, what are some thoughts around how to deal with it?
There's this sense of integrity of a system that when something has been restored or healed, there's a coming to of an integrity, and I think that, and then we also heard other sort of anecdotes about, the healing process that the individual has to be engaged in some way. We can't just impose something onto either a person or a community. So there has to be a sense of engagement. I think that there are some really basic principles of how indigenous communities have done this. Simply with circles. Native American Indians, a talking circle. And if you think about the practices of that, there's the first of all, I've done a lot of work around PTSD. The first aspect that must occur for any individual to heal is they have to feel safe. It's not about fixing or understanding. They have to first feel safe because their body is literally in, a lot of shock and reactive, and there's a whole chemistry around that. Now, we have to listen and understand, what does safety mean for the individual, for the community? What does that look like? We have no idea, and I think it truly is creating opportunities in communities to come together where we practice these skills of listening. I was so happy to hear this format. This is fantastic because we're all listening to each other. We all get to learn. It's crowdsourcing data, right? I mean, we're practicing that right now. We're respectfully listening to each other. And so we don't have to feel like, oh my God, when am I going to get that word in or what am I going to say? We have to sit and we have to wait. That process of waiting is really important because we respect each other. Everyone has an opportunity. So I think that some of these concepts, I love all the interrelationships. They are very much related. And But it seems like there's a lot of tremendous wisdom. My dad used to say, you know, Little Buzz is my nickname. There's nothing new under the sun. And when I was 10 years old, that was so oppressive to me. But now, what a relief, because it's like we don't have to recreate. There are patterns that have existed, and who are we to know? I mean, I feel like we are discovering, you know, with all of the revolutions that we've been through, and now all the technology, you know, Facebook has primed the pump. That's a wonderful thing. You know, I believe, as Buddhists say, it's an illusion that we're separate. Everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, people that use Facebook, they're sharing all the time. But what about the next level? How about if we go deeper with some meaning? And there's important things that are being shared. But I think that that's the piece that we get, that we have the opportunity to really be in touch, we have the opportunity to share information, but we also need to you know, bring back to our communities this sense of connection, respect, and integrity, and feeling safe, and really authentic, and allowing ourselves to emerge. I mean, this is nothing new, you know, but we think we know, and I think we have to have some humility around this and realize, hey, there's some stuff that's worked before.
Really, the answer to corruption has to be the imbuing of society of morality and the creation of safety, or having a sense of one's place in the world, comes from a larger belief system, which we really are lacking.
I just came back from England. My daughter just graduated from Cambridge and has done 2 theses, and one of them was on the likely reoccurrence of genocide in societies, based on how a past genocide was actually taught, how explicitly it was taught in the school systems of that country, as seen through the lens of Germany, Turkey, and Yugoslavia. 3 different genocides. One, Germany is very outspoken, we did it, it will never happen again. Yugoslavia, which is sort of vague, and Turkey, which sort of denies the Armenian massacre. Her argument is, and I think it's a well-posted one, that if you have a trauma, whether it's a genocide or it's a Hurricane Sandy that destroys a city, whatever it is, you need to take that information and make it absolutely clear what it was, what the mistakes were, and to make sure that they're not repeated again. And relying on the vagueness of faith or culture or art loses meaning over time and eventually can be misconstrued into something else, where an explicit, this is what happened, this was what done, this was the consequence, if you keep to that message, doesn't get lost.
What happens in communities where sometimes the events are quite distant to the people who are living today? And we happen to live in an environment where, because we are so incredibly stimulated by the present, that we have integration issues. Remembering, I'm not talking about the distant past, but even the recent past. We live in a kind of information-flooded environment of limited historical awareness, which is kind of a strange paradox. More information, but less context. And I will say, I wanted to add just one thought about Facebook. An organization I'm actually working very closely with right now on some research about trust and relationship building. I want to come back to that. The funny thing about Facebook is, so you can become friends with people on Facebook. Have any of you all have friends on Facebook? Yeah, these are not like friends that you have in any other circumstance. So Facebook friends. Facebook friends. You have to actually put the asterisk next to that. And the folks at Facebook, totally fascinating set of stories there. But one of them is that the kind of standard definition of a best friend. Right, a really good friend is somebody who might come over and help you move. Right, that's a pretty good definition. If you have an actual friend, will they actually come over and help you move? And the definition of a best friend is, if you call them up, will they come over and help you move a body? Right. So one of the things that's been interesting on Facebook is that they've learned. One of the things that Facebook folks have learned is that Facebook's really good at making friends, but not really good at making best friends. And so what happens is that it's very good at building what we think of as sort of oblique social solidarity. I'm a member of this group. I can demonstrate my belonging to my affiliation to my school, to my community. But it's not as good a tool for discovering and building the kind of robust friendships that actually are the ones that you count on when things have gone very significantly. And so I think the correlation is that in some ways the explosion of digital connectivity makes the analog more valuable and more important. It's what, to your point, I think makes fora like this one so critical, because there's all kinds of information passing between us that are just not available to us in a smiley face or in absences.
I work with children, and I agree with you that our sense of community and our sense of being able to be resilient draws in part on historical memory and how we tell the story. So the beautiful notion of your grandmother teaching you about the dandelions is really relevant. And when I have a student who was born in 1996 and has grown up in New York and doesn't know anything about 9/11, when we speak about resilience of cities, and that's something pretty close up in terms of them knowing it, how do we create a sense of place and a sense of self and a sense of morality that will all contribute to a collective resilience that does carry forward? I'd be curious for thoughts.
The art that I'm supporting now is socially engaged art, so it's artists all over the world that are trying to use their creativity to make social change. And what I had not thought about at all was the connection between ancient art, where history and stories reside, and artists now, and this is happening all over the world, much to my pleasure and interest, that there are artists all over the place trying to figure out how they can bring their creative minds to engage in social change and to, but not necessarily to create the projects, which is what our board has a problem wrapping their mind around, and I do sometimes also. But it's about that little bit of magic that an artist can bring to try something, and doesn't necessarily have to scale up into a big social project. And there's something in there that I would like to understand better about resilience, about people of creative mind, who are all trying to figure out the same, it seems to me, related things, and it's happening naturally around the world.
There's something called positive deviance, in which the positive deviants come up with a new solution that nobody ever thought of before, and the skeptics give them a lot of criticism of it. But when it's proven to work, the imitators copy it, and that's a key part of social diffusion. And it's really how good solutions spread so rapidly through society, because so many people are imitating. And so the creative spark, the system is dead it can't adapt without the creative spark. So finding that magic, that creative spark that puts new ideas in the system is essential for it to work.
Art requires no utilitarian justification, right? It is the purpose, not the means necessarily. But it does actually have, that doesn't mean it doesn't have utilitarian value. And the two ways in which we've seen in our own work, my work and my colleagues' work, is really in two ways, especially. One is in enabling permission for certain kinds of conversations, for certain kinds of truth-telling to occur where they are blocked elsewhere, which is an enormously important point, and it goes back to your point, which I think is an absolutely essential one, about being able to tell the truth. A friend of ours, Brian Dories, he's a dramaturge, and he is what he does is he stages readings of the plays of Sophocles, 2,500-year-old plays, in front of audiences of active duty military officers. And he tells these stories, which are ancient Greek stories about soldiers who have, through the lens of culturally appropriate metaphors, basically go crazy and experience post-traumatic stress in the wake of combat. And that's not a conversation that they're typically allowed to have. And the work of the art, because it creates a kind of narrative distance from the presence, allows them to have a conversation and begin a conversation they couldn't have otherwise, which is a critical aspect of creating the conversation in the present. I think another part of it is that also the kind of a signature way of thinking about the resilience of a system is the degree to which it carries a diversity of perspectives, a kind of cognitive diversity. Not what another word for cognitive ecology is just having many different modes of thought, expression, perspective, and that's what the arts does. It dimensionalizes the modes of understanding and consciousness, which when things go wrong are, my favorite example of this is in Iceland. So this is just 1 second story about Iceland. So Iceland had the largest per capita financial crisis in human history. Their stock market went from 9,000 points to 14 in 48 hours. Not 1,400, 14 actual points. And we told them to do all the things that we did. Bail out your banks, socialize your debt. And they did exactly the opposite. They criminally indicted their bankers. They failed to bail. They voted twice by popular referendum not to bail out their banks. And then they rewrote their constitution. And the process of rewriting the constitution was led by the country's artists. And the reason it was led by their artists was that a vast preponderance of them were musicians, and they jammed together. So they had this experience of large networks of tacit trust that had been built up because everybody knew somebody who'd been in somebody else's band. Because it was a relatively small place, that meant everybody sort of was and at least not more than 1.5 degrees removed. And so that kind of history of creative improvisation was the kind of tip of the spear for the transformation of the society. So it matters, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
This is directed towards Jonathan, based on his comments. And I love the idea that it's important in the cities to bring nature into the cities. But part of nature is not just the greenery and the trees and the parks, it's the other aesthetics, the quietness, the lack of intensity. And I find our city planners totally neglect this area. And if I could give you one or two examples, right here in New York City, tremendous emphasis relative to density, needs for mass transit. We have so many buses in this city that sometimes it's impossible to cross the street. It's not even safe. You can't even see. The lack of control of noise. There's no such thing as temporary construction in New York City. All we have is permanent construction. It's like a virus. It's always in different places. There's no controls on that. It just keeps going on and on. How do we address those issues, which really, in my opinion, relate to the overall aesthetic and well-being feeling that people can have in this city and other cities?
So the problem is that we become so utilitarian that we have ceased to become to care about aesthetics. So that would not have been a problem in a Greek city. It would not have been a problem. It was a problem. Think of Paris. So it was rebuilt in 1848. The Paris that we go to. I was in a meeting about sustainability, and there were mayors from all over the world, and the mayor of Paris was there. And every mayor made a speech and then said, "But I bow to the beauty of Paris." And they didn't just mean the mayor's a woman, they didn't just mean that. So we can design beautiful, quiet, and elegant cities that inspire us, but whose actual qualities inspire us, and we have throughout history. We just have to put that on our agenda.
China is booming. Cities are being developed every week. So with the work that you're doing on resilience and thinking about forethought as, what is good design? It's the planning of forethought. And you have this system and these theories. Are you working in these cities? And is there an example of the development of a city that's taking these ideas into consideration so that there is quiet, there is green space? Can you point to some of these cities that are being developed, at least? I'm thinking it's specific to Asia because I was just there. But
there's no great city. There's no city that has everything. But they all have many pieces of it. And probably the most impressive city, which I just was in, was Singapore. Because Singapore has enormously thoughtful central planning. And really, they're really wise about it. So I'll give you an example. Singapore decided that it wanted its island to be completely self-dependent on water. They currently get their water from Malaysia in a big pipe. So they realized to do that, they needed reservoirs. They realized to have reservoirs that function, they need a lot of green space, not only for the water, but to preserve the land around it. They then did an analysis and they recognized that 12% of the island was taken up with roads. So they said if we put in a really green, quiet, they have a beautiful new subway system. If we put in a fantastic subway system, then we can get rid of the roads, so we can have more land for open space in the reservoir. So they saw how all the pieces were interconnected, but they were all being designed towards actually the well-being of the place. I'm not seeing that degree of integration in China. So one of the reasons why when I begin looking at, there's so many things that are so beautifully connected in Singapore, is that it's an island. It's a bounded system. And I think part of the problem is when we think that every opportunity is boundless, which is the view in China right now, the constraints actually create better solutions.
The thing that I've seen is that we have a kind of monoculture of ideas. And if there's a single kind of overriding lesson to these discussions, it's that fragility resides in monocultures. One way of building, one way of making, one way of thinking. And so, I don't see, having spent a lot of time in China's new cities, they look a lot like Dallas, a few years ago. They kind of look like they are, in many instances, taking concepts of Western city building. And yet, in the context of place, resilience tends to be almost maddeningly parochial and context specific. And my favorite example of place-based resilience comes from the island of Bali, actually. But if you look at the ancient culture of Bali, this was work done by an anthropologist named Steve Lansing, who for 30 years spent time looking at Bali's both culture and religious structure and social structure and physical geography and ways of living, kind of all connected in an interconnected system. And Bali is a big volcanic lake at the top. That lake then is broken up into a series of what are called subaks because the entire island is riddled with tunnels, water tunnels that have been dug by hand over 1,000 years. So it's just like Swiss cheese. The subaks, the water tunnels carry water to smaller water temples. There's a goddess of the lake, and then a series of smaller temples, and the temples hold the water like small reservoirs. And then they're fed out through the system to irrigate rice paddies. And the interesting thing about this is that there's one time of year when all of the farmers are released essentially from the caste system in Bali and go up and perform a series of rituals together. But by and large, throughout the rest of the year, there's no central planning or central authority. Things are coordinated at a hyper-local level. And because Lansing was a connected to this place called the Santa Fe Institute. He was able to grab a group of complexity science researchers who modeled, they looked at this model, and they said, this is a complex adaptive system where the behavior of the whole system managed to get all the rice paddies irrigated, even in periods where there had been droughts and not enough rain. But no one was centrally in charge, and the behavior that emerged could not have been predicted from the small actions at the base. And the reason I mention that is because in the 1970s, the World Bank showed up. And they showed up with two things. In their left hand, they had a new brand of genetically engineered super rice. And in the right hand, they had a big bag of fertilizer, because this rice was extremely fertilizer intensive. And they said, we don't care about all your rituals, we don't care about all of these models that you use, just plant these forms of rice, and instead of doing it twice a year, you can do it 3 times a year. And the whole system collapsed within about 3 years. And all of a sudden, Bali was starving until they rejected the system and went back to their traditional practices. And literally a year ago, Bali was made the first living UNESCO World Heritage Site. Unlike Angkor Wat and these other places that Jonathan mentioned that died out because of their environmental overreach, they've sort of managed to retain the system, and the system itself, including the cultural system, is now being preserved as a matter of world heritage. And so there are examples like this, but it's not clear how you take that insight necessarily and clone it everywhere. Because if you did that everywhere, it'd be just as irresilient as putting Dallas in Beijing. You know, Balinese culture has a 2-day week, a 3-day week, a 5-day week, a 9-day week, a 13-day month, a 45-day month, a 63-day season, and they're all correlated with the basic season, the basic movement of water through the system. So their language, calendaring, sense of time, rituals associated with birth and death are all densely connected to this particular modality that absorbs kind of natural variation. It absorbs some change. But what it could not absorb was a group of guys arriving from the government saying, hey, we've got the solution for you, just right, to increase efficiency by 50%.
How do we create adaptive, resilient, and balanced systems that are both local and tie into a global scenario? And that's really what I think we're trying to figure out in some way, because until we get there, and I think that has to do with the natural systems and the economic systems as well, and the human systems.
Historically, communities fed themselves. When people were hungry, you brought food to the church, you got sent to the needy, so it was a very local environment. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, we centralized the food bank system in America, and we developed what is now the existing food bank system, which is very hub and spoke, feeding America at the center, then food banks and food pantries. And it works brilliantly, except that people who go to food pantries can no longer get fresh produce. The system's architecture works great for processed food and stopped working for locally grown, freshly sourced food. What we developed, and we're now 5 years old, is a national program that undoes that by taking advantage of the existing infrastructure that was there. Millions of growers in the community who grow food, more than they can use, 42 million. All the food pantries that are there, and the internet, and brings them all together into one thing. And the result has been that by decentralizing by not being the UNESCO in effect that you were talking about, where you walk, and I just came away from the World Food Prize last week, so I know exactly what you're talking about. By taking what is already in the community and re-energizing and reactivating it, you can make magic happen. And so for the first time now, the organization exampleharvest.org, we're enabling fresh food, that those extra tomatoes and zucchinis that you may be growing in your garden, to finally be allowed to come into the food pantry system, when in the past you've always been told no fresh food. So one of the places to actually look is coming back into the communities, which is what you alluded to when the farmers got their way, went back to their thing. That there's a lot of wisdom there in what's already on the ground that you can take advantage of. And so you don't have to develop necessarily new stuff all the time. Sometimes you have to just connect the dots between the things that have already been there.
I'm very challenged by the whole notion of scale and how does an individual find themselves in a globalized environment. And I think we've seen with the contemplative traditions that there are ways of knowing or ways of being that are really stimulated by that kind of experience that can allow people to locate themselves even in a very ambiguous or volatile environment. And I think that artists also do that as well. Artists are really great about, being able, the whole essence of creativity and the creative process is being open to chance, being open to just not trying to predetermine or over-determine whatever it is they're working on. So I really take heart that there's so much incredible work that's being done around the world to bring this kind of wisdom and this mode of knowing and being forward, because I think it'll help people really find their place and find the language to express that sense of place in a very, very large and complex and confusing environment. So, I'm very, very delighted that the artists now are, and Shelley, you've been working on the forefront of this. Many, many artists are really beginning to explore and use contemplative practices in their work as a mode of helping people make those kinds of connections.
Where we are, the conversation we're having proceeds by scientific insight and by anecdote and by remembrance and by lots of paths, right? This is a very early conversation we're having. So it's the realm of heuristics, not laws. But one of the heuristics that seems to be really consistent is that resilience, genuine resilience abhors distant dependencies. Distance. So dependent. What I mean is that being dependent on. So when a group of people in Iraq are dependent for their political negotiations on a group of people in Washington, that system is irresilient, and we see just perfect expressions of that. And that is a way of, so if the inverse of that observation, or the heuristic that attends that observation, is that if we want to build resilience, we have to trim those dependencies.
Accept.
Right.
Yes, see, you're totally right. Sometimes there's a nest that encompasses all, and we locally have to nurture it, but it has distant dependencies.
That's why it's a heuristic.
That if you take the theory of relativity and you merge it with the theory of quantum physics, time does not exist. And therefore, those of you who want to stay are welcome to stay. And you stay forever, because forever is not as an instant. But those of you who live in relative reality, we're so happy that you came. Thank you very much. And Andrew can explain more, by the way, of what actually happens when you put these two together.